Well, hey, everybody, and welcome to the This Awesome Life podcast. This is simply a collection of stories that point to purpose. In our normal episodes, we would talk to a friend, we'd hear their story, and we talk about the moments in which God showed up in their life and led them forward in their calling. However, today, I thought we would do a very special bonus episode where I kind of talk about another one of my stories and just dig into it a little bit more. Now, a lot of these stories will be coming from my blog that you can check out at thisawesome.life if you want to go that direction. But I thought it would be fun to give this a shot, do a little experiment, and see what you think about me putting this, my blog content, basically into this format. I know a lot of you that listen to the podcast don't read the blog and vice versa. So I thought, hey, let's see what happens if we repurpose some of this content. And so today I grabbed one of my favorite posts that I've written in a while, and it's called Remember, Remember. Now, again, you can see this post if you want to over at thisawesome.life. That's where I've got over 100 blog posts of just stories from my life that have helped me figure out a little bit more about who God is and what he wants from me. And so today, let's just dive in to Remember, and see what we can learn together about our forgetfulness as people and what God would have for us in those situations. Well, hey, and thank you so much for listening to the This Awesome Life podcast. I wanted to take a quick second to tell you about my brand new book, Magic in the Mug. Now, this book is all about how a single cup of coffee can help us discern our purpose and learn a little bit more about who God has called each of us to be. Head over to magicinthemug.com. That's where you're going to find all the information you need, and I really hope to see you there. Recently, I found out that the word remember appears in Scripture over 200 times. There's a lot. There's a lot of times when God calls us to remember, or says the word remember for various reasons. And these references are kind of grouped into several main categories, about three main categories that I've found that each carry really valuable insight for us as believers, as followers of Jesus, and just as people in general who are trying to live life of purpose, right? Like if we can remember things, then typically it's better off. It's better for relationships when we can remember what our significant others tell us. It's better for us personally when we can remember the lessons that we've learned so we don't have to do them over and over and over again. But as it relates to Scripture, I think understanding the three categories in which we see this word remember can really deepen our understanding of God's relationship with his people, and it can help us understand a little bit more the consequences that we face when we forget. And so let's take a second and explore them. You know, the first category is really, we see God remembering something on behalf of his people. God remembers something that he said, not because he forgot it, but because he chose to call it to mind. There's a great example of this in Genesis 9:15, and it's the point where God assures Noah, he tells Noah for a fact that he will never destroy the earth with a flood again. In fact, he says that God, he will remember his covenant not to destroy all life with a flood again. And this type of remembrance, like I said, isn't God recalling something he's forgotten, but it signifies this active commitment to his people's well-being. Like he is just recalling purposefully that he is committed to this relationship no matter what. There was no qualifiers in that promise. It was just, I remember the covenant that I will not destroy all life with a flood again. It's an active remembering. It's kind of, for us, the remembering the good times, remembering a happy thing that has happened in our life, or just calling to mind something that makes us smile. It's that kind of remembrance, or remembering your kid's birthday or something like that. You don't forget those things, but you do have to actively call them to mind from time to time. And this is what God is doing when he says that he's going to remember this covenant. He is actively calling to mind how much he loves his people and how much he does not want to destroy his creation again in such a way. And I think it's just a beautiful thing to think that God, the God that created it all, that held it all, that holds it all together in his hands, I just see it's a beautiful thing that he would actively call to mind the promises that he's made to us, as insignificant as we can seem, as insignificant as we can feel in the midst of this massive creation. God actively calls to mind his promises. He actively calls to mind how much he loves us. He actively calls these things to mind so that he can continue to bless us. And again, it's just such a beautiful thing that I think that we can learn from that And we can actively call to mind moments with other people. We can actively call to mind great things about relationships. We can actively call to mind blessings and reasons to have gratitude and the great things about God and this creation. And even in the midst of our difficulty, even in the midst of suffering sometimes, we can actively call these things to mind and be more Christ-like in that way. Because in this moment, God knows what's going to happen, God knows that the flood didn't wipe out sin forever. God knew that we were going to continue to be a wandering people. He was going to have cause to destroy all of creation again, and yet he made a covenant anyway and continually actively calls it to mind, even in the midst of the times that we break his heart, even in the midst of times when we wander away, even in the midst of times when we are as far from God as we can be. He actively calls to mind the fact that he loves us and that he is going to continue to love us and continue to hold all of this together because he made this covenant and he remembers it and he is actively calling it to mind on a regular basis. So what can you actively call to mind right now that can help you in your situation, whether it's a good thing or whether you're in a difficult time? What are the things that you can actively call to mind so that you can have that sort of positive attitude, not like positive in like a everything's fine sort of way, but just knowing that there's a path forward. When we actively call our blessings to mind, when we actively call these things to mind and remember them on purpose, with a purpose, it can help us through the darkest times and it can help us sustain the best of times. And so, whoever's, when you're connected to people, when you're in relationship, there are hard times, even in the best of times. And so I would just encourage you, that first category of remembering, God actively calling to mind the things that he said, the things that he's promised. How can you live that out in your life and your relationships today? The second category that I see remembering, it centers on God urging his people to remember significant events or blessings. And so we dove into that a little bit, but it's an encouragement from God for his people to actively call these things to mind. God reminds us on a regular basis of how he has cared for us and how he has loved us. He reminds us on a regular basis how much we have to be thankful for. He reminds us on a regular basis that he will provide for our needs, that he is sovereign and holds the keys to it all, and reminds us in little ways through these blessings, through these moments in our life where he just shows up. And in Deuteronomy 5:15, Moses is speaking on behalf of God, and he commands the Israelite nation to remember their liberation from slavery in Egypt. And he emphasizes God's faithfulness and his love by recalling their past. And so by them recalling that past, God encourages obedience to his commands, which ultimately lead to an abundant life. I think a lot of times when we think about commands from somebody, whether it's an authority figure like a boss or a parent or someone like that, we think about them in a negative way. We want this idea of freedom so bad that any sort of command or directive or strong encouragement or strong suggestion, whatever language is used around that, anything like that, we see as bad, as negative. Like, oh, someone's telling me what to do. The man's trying to hold me down again, and I just don't want to live my life like this. I want to be free. And we can get so stuck on this idea of freedom that we miss the fact that true and ultimate freedom comes from God when we follow his commands. God's commands are not meant to box us in. They are meant to provide the ultimate freedom. And it's easy to think that, well, freedom means that I can do whatever I want. But that's not what it means. Freedom is the ability to live in the most blessed way, in a full life that John 10:10, Jesus says he came to give life and give life to the fullest, or to give an abundant life. And life to the fullest is not being weighed down by sin. Life to the fullest is being free from the bondage of sin and free to love Jesus and live the life that he's called us to live. That is the ultimate freedom. And we think too often that sort of, those sort of guidelines or those sort of commands are the opposite of freedom, when actually they're the pathway to freedom. They're the pathway to be free from guilt, to be free from shame, and to be free from sorrow. The way that we do this is by living out what Jesus has called us to. I'm not talking about perfection. We're going to stumble, we're going to fall, we're going to struggle. But what I'm talking about is living out what God called to the best of our ability, because when we do that, we experience true freedom. It's upside down, it's backwards, it doesn't make sense on paper, but it makes sense when you live it out. When you follow God's commands, you experience freedom in a way that you've never experienced before. And yet, it feels, or it seems, or it sounds so restrictive. You know, I think a lot of people look at Christianity, they look at Jesus, and they think that it's that this life of a Christ follower is a life of living out this big list of things that we just don't do. You know, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. And sometimes it can feel that way, because I think as people, that's what we've communicated far too often. I think way too often we've communicated the things that we're against and the things that we shouldn't do, as opposed to communicating the things that we're for, and the things that bring life. And that's what I'm talking. That is freedom. The things that bring us life, that is true freedom. And you will find that true freedom when you come to know Jesus, when you follow him, and when you live out these commands that God has put into place. You know, same for this Israelite nation. So often they were like, we want to go back. We want to go back to Egypt. It was better there. We had fish to eat. And I love fish. Don't get me wrong. I do. But man, I know what's on the other side of following Jesus. And ultimately, no matter what you're comparing it to that the world seems to have to offer, it's better on the other side. It's better when we follow Jesus. It's better when we live out those commands. That is when we experience the fullness of joy and the fullness of life and true, authentic freedom. And so I want to encourage you today through that, as God urges his people to remember these significant events or blessings, I would encourage you to do the same thing. If you're following Jesus, if you have that relationship with him, remember what he brought you out of. Remember where you were before you met him. Remember who you were before you met him, and the bondage that was, and the struggle, and the pain, and the sorrow, and the shame. Remember who you were, and be thankful for who you are now. Be thankful for where he's brought you. Be thankful to what he's brought you to. You know, I think a lot of times we look at our life, and as a Christ follower, I know for a fact, man, I've got so far to go. I've got so far to go. I need to grow so much. I need to develop so much. There's so much in me that is still so worldly, and I need to give it to Jesus and grow through that by his power. And if I look at that only, if I focus on that, if I focus on how far I have to go, I'm always going to be discouraged. I'm always going to feel judged. I'm always going to feel boxed in. I'm always going to feel like I can't measure up. But if I remember instead what he's brought me from, if I remember instead how far I've already come, then it is so far. I can be encouraged by that. I can look back and see who I was before I came into this relationship with Jesus. I can see the mistakes that I've made. I can look back and see the type of person I was, and the people that I hurt along the way. I can look at all that and know that that person is gone. That person is no more. I have come so far. And if you knew me back then, props to knowing me now, because I was not easy to know back then. And sometimes that can be difficult to know now. I get that. But again, yeah, I've got a long way to go, but I have come so far. And that is all because of the grace and the power of Jesus. And so again, remember the past. Remember what God has brought you through. Lastly, there's this third category of when God says remember, when Scripture says remember. And I think that this is the one that trips us up as people the most often. And it involves the stories, in Scripture, it involves the stories in which individuals or groups just fail to remember. And every time these groups or people fail to remember whatever they're supposed to remember, the consequences are disastrous every time. And these accounts for us, like these stories for us, should and can serve as cautionary tales that actually protect us from falling victim to the same pitfalls. You know, there's a great example in 2 Kings 24, and it's again the entire nation of Israel. They've come so far, right? They've connected with God. They've followed Him. They've been in this up and down relationship. They continue though to forget who God is. And in this particular case, they forget God's deeds, they abandon His commands, and they start engaging in detestable behaviors. Idol worship, child sacrifice, just crazy sin patterns, because they forget who God is, and they forget how much He loves them, and they forget that following the Lord actually leads to freedom and not bondage. And as a result, they end up getting exiled from their own nation. They lose the protection and the blessings that come with that obedience. And they end up in exile in a foreign land, basically right back in slavery where they had started from. Their cities get burned to the ground, and it's just bad news for everyone. It's really sad to see because they had it so good. And I think that part of the problem is that they were so comfortable that they forgot that they needed God. They got so used to his protection and His provision that they forgot where it came from. They got so comfortable with their surroundings that they forgot to be grateful for them, and thus be grateful to the person or the God, the only true God that provided them. And I think that it's so hard to remember these things sometimes because our life gets too comfortable. And when that happens, we don't feel like we need God. And we don't feel like we need God, we don't approach Him like we should. And when we don't approach Him, we kind of forget, you know? It's like that friend that you haven't texted in 6 months, you know? You might think about them every now and again. Like, oh, I really should reach out. But it's crazy how fast 6 months can turn into 5 years. It's crazy to think that 5 years could go by without you talking to a person that you were really connected to. But you know how that happens? With a week. It starts with a week of not talking to somebody, and then a month, and then 2 months, and then it gets to that point where it'd be awkward to text them now or call them now. It's been too long, and then it's 6 months, and then it's a year that you haven't talked to them, and you don't even think about them anymore. And then you see them pop up on your social media feed at some point, and you're like, oh, it's been a while since I talked to them. You open up your phone and you look, and it's literally been 5 years since you talked to them. It's so easy to forget. It's so easy to forget when something's not right in front of our face. You know, as people, we talk about having the memory of a goldfish on regular occasions. It's like a popular saying because apparently goldfish don't have a very long memory, which I actually think that that's not true. You should Google it. But anyway, like we talk about this. But I think sometimes it's easier to have the memory of a person than to have the memory of a goldfish because we're so quick to forget the good things. We're so quick to forget the blessings that we have. We're so quick to forget the important relationships because we don't connect as often as we should. And today, right now, I think the challenge of remembering becomes even more pronounced because our lives have gotten so busy and we've let them get busy. And for example, recently I was in a roundtable conversation. Everybody in this conversation was answering the same question. It was like a question for the table. And so literally everyone just answered. And so I was kind of trying to facilitate this conversation, lead the conversation a little bit. So I would call in somebody from the table and say, hey, what's your answer to this question? What's your answer? And so we got around the table and I looked at one of the guys at the table and I asked him, I said, hey, what, we hadn't heard from you yet. What's your answer? And immediately, everyone else at the table let me know that he had answered that question minutes before. Minutes. And even him, he's like, I already answered the question. And to this day, I still have no recollection of that part of the conversation or his answer. And honestly, it was pretty embarrassing. in the moment, I got roasted by the entire table, which, that's not the worst part because it happens. I get roasted by a whole table full of people on a regular basis. It's just sort of my life. But I was embarrassed because I communicated to this person that I wasn't invested in the conversation and I wasn't invested in them personally, and that I was too busy to listen to them. Thankfully, a sincere apology and a different behavior going forward repaired the situation, and it reminded me to be more engaged with the people that are right in front of me. For me, this was a moment of discomfort. Like it was just a quick moment where things were awkward. But for the people of Israel, their inability to remember what God did for them derailed their nation for years. Years and years and years, hundreds. And the truth is that remembering can be a challenge, but bad things happen when we forget. I mean, bad things happen when we forget. Whether it's forgetting to take a right turn when the GPS tells you and you end up in the wrong place, or forgetting that there's no plywood on the porch that you're working on. That's a story for another day. Bad things happen when we forget. And to be honest with you, I think that to fulfill our God-given purpose, we have to start with remembering what God's done for us. We've got to remember the blessings that we've received. We've got to trust that He's faithful because He is. And when we forget the blessings, we forget that He's faithful. When we forget that He's faithful, we don't approach Him like we should. We have to remember the blessings that we've received. On the other hand, we have to remember the storms that we've weathered. We have to remember the difficult times that we've been through. Why? Because those are the times when God is helping us grow and moving us towards being ready for the purpose that He's called us to. We've got to remember the storms that we've weathered, and we need to be grateful for them. And that's hard to say. I feel like I'm in the midst of several storms right here, right now. And I know in my head that God is using those storms to prepare me for something. But my heart is having a really hard time keeping up with that truth. But if I look back and I remember the storms that I've weathered before, then God will He will use that to give me the strength to weather the ones that I'm in right now. Every time. And I know this. And I know it in my head, and it's easy for me to say on this microphone. It is hard to get my heart to buy in. But we have to remember the storms we've weathered, because those are the tools that we have to move forward in our purpose. And then last, we have to remember the relationships that God has brought into our lives to point us forward. All of these things, the blessings that He's given, the storms we've weathered, and the relationships that He's brought to us, all point us forward if we refuse to forget. If we refuse to forget. Because when we fail to remember these moments, when we fail to remember these seasons, we run the risk of damaging or even completely derailing our calling. I mean, honestly, look at the nation of Israel. They had a job to do. They had their own land. They had a purpose, and they forgot all of those things. They forgot the purpose. They forgot how blessed they were to live in the land. They forgot the relationships that they had as a result. They forgot all of it, and it completely derailed them for centuries. And even after they got back to that land, they still didn't do it right. They still kind of messed up. And there's room for that. We're going to mess up. We're humans. Like, that's just kind of par for the course. But at the same time, we have to remember as best we can. And the best way to do that is to just, figure out a system. And I hate to get super practical at the end here. In my own life, I've started to do this. I've started collecting my stories in two ways. One, I literally have a spreadsheet that's called the story file, and I will just write down a couple of words in that spreadsheet so that I can remember the stories. I mean, seriously, some of them are like the duck pond incident, or the cave, or getting lost on a bus. All of these things are actual stories in my story file, and at some point will become blog posts. That the getting lost on a bus one is a blog post, and there's actually a friend of mine invited me on her podcast, and I told that story. So if you want to hear it, I'll put that in the show notes for this one, her podcast, as well as the link to my blog. That's a fun one. But literally whenever I think of a story, whenever I remember something, whenever a memory surfaces, or the best time for this is when I'm in conversation with my sister, because she just loves to bring up all these old stories from the past. The glory days, as it were. We'll talk about high school and childhood on a regular basis, and I always find myself just laughing out loud at some of the things that she remembers, but then I'll write them down in that story file, because I know how important it is for me to be able to remember those things, the good ones and the bad ones. The highs and the lows, all of them have been telling the story of my life and pointing me towards who God has called me to be. And currently in that story file, in that spreadsheet, I have over 100 stories. And each of these stories, like I said, serves as a reminder of God's work in my life. But I know, here's what I know, even having over 100 stories, there are countless moments that I've forgotten. There are countless moments that I don't remember, that I haven't written down yet, that God hasn't reminded me of yet. And I pray, I honestly do, I pray that God will continue to bring these moments to the forefront of my mind, and He'll continue to allow me to celebrate and remember them. And I continue to pray that I'll be able to live out these stories, and I'll be able to use them for a purpose, not my own purpose. That's kind of lame and shallow-sighted and short-sighted, but for His purpose. Because I know that when I'm living out His purpose, again, back to the freedom thing, when I'm living out His purpose, when I'm living out the life that He's called me to live, man, that is when life is at its peak. That is when life is at its best. And that is like where Paul was when he wrote Philippians 4:13, which says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. We've kind of co-opted this verse to mean I can get a touchdown if I try hard enough, and because Jesus loves me. But Paul was talking about being in a really rough season of life. He was talking about all the things that he had gone through in his time on earth so far. He was talking about being homeless and abandoned and shipwrecked and naked and hungry, and all of these bad things that had happened to him. He listed out. And then he said after that, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And that is what I hope my stories become for myself and for others, is that strength, because I know what God has for me on the other side of the difficult seasons. And I know what God has for me in the midst of the great ones. Our purpose in life, what God has called us to, it is so intertwined with our stories. Every day that you walk through this life, God is speaking to you. He's telling you something. He's whispering through every moment, through every experience, through every conversation, through every conflict, through every random interaction in a grocery store. I don't know. I'm just making these things up at this point. Our purpose is so intertwined with our stories that if we are to continue living and pursuing that purpose, we have to remember and celebrate what God's done. Plain and simple. If we are going to continue to pursue our purpose, we have to remember and celebrate the things that God has done. There's no way around it. That is where it comes from. That is where our purpose is found. Our purpose is being communicated to us in every moment of every day. My friend Tara told me not too long ago, as we were talking about this concept of purpose. It's on the episode of the podcast that she was on, episode 4. Definitely check that one out. It was awesome. It was amazing. But she said, I just have to remember that my purpose is whatever I have in my hand, whatever God's given me in the moment. She said, I have to know that I was made for this moment. But then I have to also remember that I was made for the next one. I was made for this moment, and I was also made for the next one. And I remember when she said that, just being like, I literally like started writing it down as we were having this conversation, recording the episode, because it was just so impactful for me to just remember that our purpose is not some massive thing. It is what we have in our hand. Our purpose is found in what God has given us right now, and then our purpose will continue to be found in the things that He gives us along the way. We were made for this moment. You were made for this moment, but you were also made for the next one. So today I would encourage you to take some time to remember what God has done in your life. Consider, what are some specific blessings or pivotal moments that you tend to forget? What do you tend to forget that when you do remember, just lights you up? take the time to look back and remember those things. Remember the moments that lit you up with joy. Remember the moments that made you just excited to be where you were. Remember the moments in which your vision aligned with your life. You know, we all have this vision of our life where we're like, this is what I want. And there are moments when that vision is happening in real life, in real time. We see it, we feel it, and we're just like, this is it. This is it. The problem is when we move past those moments, when we get back to the day-to-day or to the spots where our vision and our life are not as closely aligned, we tend to forget that we've experienced the moments that have been incredible. I want to be the kind of person that remembers those moments. I want to be the kind of person that's grateful for those moments. I want to be the kind of person that when I'm when I am experiencing a difficult moment, I can look back and say, God got me through it last time, he'll do it again. And again, like I said a few minutes ago, I'm preaching to myself right now. Like, I need to be better at that. I need to get better at remembering those moments. I need to get better at reminding myself, at actively calling to mind the things that God has done for me. And like I said, I do that intentionally now as best as I can through my story file, and I just need to continue to get better. Where I could get better is remembering the stories as they happen instead of remembering the stories from long ago. Like as I look at my story file, all of my stories are mostly like years old. I'm not great at recognizing a great story when it's happening. And I should get better at that. I've captured a couple of moments recently where I'm like, oh, this is one of those moments. And I need to celebrate that, but I need to get way better at capturing the stories as they're happening. So let me ask you this. How can you incorporate intentional remembrance into your daily life? When you do, it's going to strengthen your faith. It's going to deepen your relationships, and it's going to deepen your relationships and trust in God. I would encourage you to do it, whether it's to create your own story file or, start sharing those moments of gratitude with somebody. Write a gratitude journal. Just remember what God has done for you. And let me encourage you, and let me say that I just hope that we can be the kind of people that never lose sight of his faithfulness as we live out our purpose, because he is the one that provides it. Hey, thanks so much for listening to the This Awesome Life podcast. This is just a collection of stories that point to purpose. To stay connected with This Awesome Life, check out the show notes. That's where you're going to find all the information and all the other ways to get connected with me and the This Awesome Life community. The blog's down there, my newsletter's down there, my social media links are down there, and I'd love to connect with you in any of those ways. Also, I've got a book coming out soon, and I am super excited to share it with you. It's all about how we can find our purpose through a single cup of coffee. And maybe that seems far-fetched to you, but I'm telling you, it's possible. The process that coffee goes in to get from a seed to our cup is incredible. And it teaches us so much about what we can learn through our own process and our own journey. I'd love for you to check it out. You can check that out at magicinthemug.com. And again, that link is in the show notes. If you love This Awesome Life, I'd love for you to take a minute and leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find this podcast, and I would love to know that we are making a difference in this space. Don't forget to like and follow the This Awesome Life podcast so that you never miss an episode. And once again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on This Awesome Life.